In the second edition of the Rothschild dynasty, we are at 1919 and following the First World War. At this stage, Amschel Rothschild has passed on, as well as all of his 5 sons that actually started this dynasty in various countries around the world. We ended with a Versailles Peace Conference that had to decide on reparations that the Germans needed to pay the victors at the end of the First World War. At this historic conference, 117 Zionists that was headed by Bernard Baruch bring up the subject of the promise of Palestine for them. This is where the Germans realize why America had actually turned against them and under whose influence. They realized that it was the Rothschilds. This is extremely important in the context of the build-up to the Second World War, and things will make a lot more sense if you look at things on a larger scale, and especially a large scale that includes the wheelings and dealings of the Rothschild family. The Germans felt that they were naturally betrayed by the Zionist movement that started in America, and they were extremely upset by their actions. The reason they felt betrayed by the Zionists is because up until this point, Germany has actually been an extremely friendly country towards the Jews, and they actually had a very specific Emancipation Edict of 1822 that guaranteed all Jews in Germany all civil rights enjoyed by normal Germans. But this narrative of Germany being friendly to Jewish people had to change because of the Rothschilds, via the agreement with Britain, agreed to bring America into the war. Remember the pogroms we spoke about in the previous video? All these pogroms that happened within Russia and within Poland, where people were just randomly attacked, many of them Jewish people. At the time of this happening, Germany was the only country in Europe that did not place any restrictions on Jewish people. They even gave them refuge when they had to flee from Russia after the first attempted communist coup failed there in 1905. The handover of Palestine to the Jewish people was a very important part of the post-First World War plan, and the Rothschild held up their side of the bargain, and they ended up spilling millions of people's innocent blood, and Palestine was confirmed a Jewish homeland. And while the handover to the Rothschilds took place, because they need to keep it under British control, because the Rothschilds control Britain. At this particular time in world history, only about 1% of the population of Palestine was Jewish. It will be interesting for you to note at this time that the main boss of the Versailles Peace Conference was Baron Edmund de Rothschild. This conference would also be the start of this idea that would build up to what would later become the United Nations. So the Versailles Peace Conference is used by the Rothschild to set up a world government under the pretext of ending all wars, which they actually ended up creating. This attempted one world government at the time was called the League of Nations. Fortunately, there were not enough countries that accepted it, and this idea soon died off. But it's not that they would end up trying. On March 29th of 1919, the Times of London, a newspaper, reported of the Bolsheviks in Russia. One of the curious features of the Bolshevist movement is the high percentage of non-Russian elements among its leaders. Of the 20 or 30 commissaries or leaders who provide the central machinery of the Bolshevist movement, not less than 75% were Jews. Remember that the Rothschilds were extremely angry with the Russian government because they were not allowed to start a central bank within their nation. But the Rothschilds always have a plan, as per their long history of plans to subvert and get whatever they want. They gathered groups of Jewish spies and sent them into Russia to drum up a revolution for the benefit of the common man. Does this sound familiar to things that happen in South Africa? Using groups of people coming in, making as if they're trying to save the nation, and then handing over to a Rothschild-controlled government. These Jewish spies were in age-old tradition given Russian names. For example, Trotsky was a member of the first group and his original name was Bronstein. These groups were sent to areas throughout Russia to incite riots and rebellion. The Jewish Post International edition, week ending January 24th of 1999, confirms that Vladimir Lenin was Jewish. Lenin is also on record as having stated, and I quote, "The establishment of a central bank is 90% of communizing a nation." This should also sound very familiar with regards to what our very own government has been up to of late. These Rothschild-funded Bolsheviks would go on in the course of history to slaughter around 60 million Christians and non-Jewish people in Soviet-controlled territory. Remember, at the time, Soviet control was absolutely vast. And in a much forgotten past of history, because of the Rothschild-controlled mainstream media, it is easy to forget the Zionist movement influence and how it affected the rest of the world at the time. Remember in the last video and first edition that the Zionist movement was deliberately formed to achieve many of the Rothschild's objectives. In the work of the author Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his work Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, it affirmed that the Zionist Jews created and administered the organized Soviet concentration camp system, in which tens of millions of Christians and non-Jews actually died. On page 79 of this book, he actually goes on to name the main administrators of this greatest killing machine in the history of the world. Not much spoken of today now, is it? They were Aaron Saltz, Yakov Rappaport, Lazar Kogan, Matvey Berman, Kenrik Yogoda, and Naftali Frenkel. All six are Zionist Jews. And in 1970, Solzhenitsyn would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his literature. So this is not just any person writing this. Remember the company that the Rothschild started, N.M. Rothschild and Sons? They were given a permanent role to fix the world's daily gold price. Now just imagine a family given the right to decide on things such as this. This regularly took place in the City of London offices daily at 11 o'clock in the same room until 2004. Now we finally get to 1920, and this is where it gets even more interesting. Not as if the past history has not been interesting at all. But here we go. Winston Churchill, whose mother was Jenny Jacobson Jerome, was Jewish, meaning under the Ashkenazi Jewish law, he was born of a Jewish mother and therefore was considered Jewish. He actually wrote an article in the Illustrated Sunday Herald, dated February 8th. Remember, this is in 1920. And I quote, "From the days of Illuminati leader Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx to those of Trotsky, this worldwide conspiracy has been steadily growing. And now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and become the undisputed masters of that enormous empire." Close quote. Remember Jacob Schiff? In 1921, under the orders of Jacob Schiff, the Council on Foreign Relations, or the CFR, is founded by Bernard Baruch and Colonel Edward Mandelhaus. Schiff gave his orders prior to his death in 1920, as he knew an organization in America needed to be set up to select politicians to carry on the Rothschild conspiracy, and the formation of the CFR was actually agreed in a meeting on May 30th, 1919 at the Hotel Majestic in Paris, France. The CFR membership at the start was approximately 1,000 people in the United States. This membership included the heads of virtually every industrial empire in America, all the American-based international bankers, and the heads of all their tax-free foundations. In essence, all those people who would provide the capital, the money required for anyone who wished to run for Congress, the Senate, or the presidency. And if you think about the American political system, this is exactly what is happening to this very day. Don't forget my video on Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, where I explained how much money was spent to get Cyril Ramaphosa elected, close on R1 billion. In true Rothschild fashion, the first job of the Council of Foreign Relations, or the CFR, was to gain control of the press. This very important task was given to J.D. Rockefeller, or John D. Rockefeller as he was famously known, who set up a number of national news magazines such as Life and Time. He also financed Samuel Newhouse to buy up and establish a chain of newspapers all across the country, and Eugene Meyer also, who would go on to buy up many publications such as the Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Weekly Magazine. The Council on Foreign Relations also had to, very importantly, get control of radio, television, and obviously the motion picture industry, basically Hollywood. This task was split among the international bankers from Kuhn Loop, who we spoke of before, Goldman Sachs, the Warburgs, and the Leymans. Now we move on to 1925. This year's Jewish Encyclopedia states of the existence of Jews who represent approximately 90% of so-called world Jewry, with a startling admission that the so-called enemy of the Jews, Esau, also known as Edom, see Genesis 36 with verse 1 if you want a biblical reference, now actually represents the Jewish race. When on page 42 of the volume 5, it is stated, Edom is in modern Jewry. Now, I am by no means saying personally that this is true. What I am showing is that in history, that the people stated that it was so, whether true or not. These very complicated statements that are difficult to verify has caused a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment and has caused many people's deaths throughout the world. This entire notion that the majority of the Jewish nation, or 90% of them, considered as Ashkenazi Jews, were actually Gentiles, caused huge problems at the time. I want to make it clear at this time that this is only for historic information and that I personally do not lay claims to any of these things said in that time or what people would believe on a religious basis with regards to where Jewish people come from. In 1926, N.M. Rothschild and Sons refinanced the Underground Electric Railway Company of London Limited, which has a controlling interest in the entire London Underground transport system. And Morris de Rothschild has a son, Edmund de Rothschild, to help continue the Rothschild dynasty. In 1929, famously, the Rothschilds crashed the United States economy by contracting the very money supply that they need. In 1930, their power base increases. The Rothschild starts the very first World Bank, or the Bank for International Settlements, or the BIS, and it's established in Basel, Switzerland, the same place as where 33 years earlier the first ever World Zionist Congress was held. Remember, I covered that in the previous video, just in case you need to refresh yourself. Now we move on to 1933, and on January the 30th, Adolf Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. He drives Jews, many of which were communist, out of governmental positions within Germany. As a result of this, in July, the Jews hold a world conference in Amsterdam, during which they demand that Hitler reinstate every Jew back to his former position. Hitler refuses to reinstate these people, and as a result, someone from my previous video, Samuel Untermyer, who blackmailed President Wilson, remember, for his affair, and is now the head of the American delegation and the president of the whole conference, returns to the United States and makes a speech on radio, which was transcribed from the New York Times on Monday, August 7th, 1933. In the speech, he made the following statements, and I quote, "The Jews are the aristocrats of the world. Our campaign is the economic boycott against all German goods, shipping and services. What we are proposing is to prosecute a purely defensive economic boycott that will undermine the Hitler regime and bring the German people to their senses by destroying their export trade on which their very existence depends. Each of you, Jew and Gentile alike, must refuse to deal with any merchant or shopkeeper who sells any German-made goods or who patronizes German ships or shipping. Close quote. As 2/3 of Germany's food supply had to be imported and could only be imported with the proceeds of what they exported, if Germany could not export, 2/3 of Germany's population would starve to death, as there would be not enough food for more than 1/3 of the population. As a result of this boycott, Jews throughout America would protest outside and damage any stores in which they found any products with "Made in Germany" printed on them, causing stores to have to dump these products or risk bankruptcy. Once the effects of this boycott began to be felt in Germany, the Germans, who had demonstrated no violence towards the Jews up to this point, simply began boycotting Jewish stores in the same way the Jews had done to stores selling German products in America. Now, it's important to note at this point that it was a Zionist movement that incited all of this, that you cannot bring all Jewish people into this equation, that it was driven by Rothschild influence. Remember that the Rothschild plan is to actually finance both sides of a war, and this will become very clear when it came to the build-up of the Second World War. Remember that their main aim is a new world order with a new one world government and a one world leader. If you do not have this main goal in sight, very few things would actually make sense. The Rothschilds finance IBM and supply machines to the Nazis, which produce punch cards to help organize and manage the initial identification and social expulsion of Jews, the confiscation of their property, and their extermination. On November 16 of this year, President Roosevelt recognizes the Zionist regime of Stalin in Russia without consultation with Congress, even as 8,000 Ukrainians march in protest in New York itself. Also in this year, President Roosevelt, who was actually born of a Jewish mother, therefore under the Ashkenazi rules of being Jewish, he would be seen as a Jew, he orders that the all-seeing eye should be placed on all new dollar bills along with the motto Novus Ordo Seclorum. This is Latin for a new order of the ages. In 1934, Swiss banking secrecy laws are reformed and it becomes an offense resulting in imprisonment for any bank employee to violate bank secrecy, all serving the Rothschild purposes. This is all in preparation for the Rothschild-engineered Second World War, in which, as usual, they will fund both sides. In 1934, Edmund de Rothschild dies. In 1936, with regard to the increase in anti-Semitism in Germany, Samuel Landman, and at the time he was a secretary to the World Zionist Organization, in his 1936 book Great Britain, the Jews and Palestine, states the following of the United States' entry into World War I, and I quote, "The fact that it was Jewish help that brought USA into the war on the side of the Allies has rankled ever since in German, especially Nazi minds, and has contributed in no small measure to the prominence which anti-Semitism occupies in the Nazi program." Close quote. In 1938, on the 7th of November, a Jewish person, Herschel Greenspan, assassinated Ernst von Rath, a minor official at the German embassy in Paris. As a result of this, German hostility towards Jews in Germany started to turn violent. The Rothschilds' Austrian banking house in Vienna, SM von Rothschild und Sonne, closes then following the Nazi occupation of Austria. In 1939, IG Farben, the leading producer of chemicals in the world and the largest German producer of steel, dramatically starts to increase its production. This increased production is almost exclusively used to arm Germany for the Second World War, so they were preparing well before the time. This company was controlled by the Rothschilds and would go on to use Jews and other disaffected peoples as slave labor in the concentration camps. IG Farben also created the lethal Zyklon B gas that was used to exterminate the Jews in the gas chambers. On the 1st of September of that year, the Second World War starts when Germany invades Poland. This was because the German leadership were a Christian leadership, who understood that Soviet Russia was led by Rothschild-funded communists, and they feared that as the Soviet Union grew in strength, these Jewish communists would invade and wipe all the Christians off the map. In 1940, Hans-Jürgen Kuhler in his book Inside the Gestapo states the following of Maria Ann Schicklgruber, Adolf Hitler's grandmother. And I quote, "A little servant girl came to Vienna and became a domestic servant at the Rothschild mansion, and Hitler's unknown grandfather must be probably looked for in this magnificent house." Close quote. This was backed up by Walter Lange in his book The Mind of Hitler, in which he states, and I quote, "Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Maria Ann Schicklgruber. Maria Ann Schicklgruber was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered the pregnancy, she was sent back home, where Alois was born." Close quote. Obviously, on the surface, it would appear that Hitler was unlikely to be a Rothschild, but then again, when you discover the benefits that the Rothschilds got out of this war, both financially and politically, a Rothschild connection does not appear as outlandish as it may initially seem. There is obviously no solid proof for any of these assertions, but the mind wanders. In 1941, President Roosevelt takes America into the Second World War by refusing to sell Japan any more steel, scrap, or oil. Japan was in the midst of a war against China, and without that scrap, steel, and oil, Japan would be unable to continue that war. Japan was totally dependent upon the United States for both steel, scrap, and oil. Roosevelt knew this action would provoke the Japanese to attack America, which they subsequently did at Pearl Harbor. Now things get really interesting. In 1942, Prescott Bush, does that surname sound familiar? Father of future American President George Herbert Walker and George W., has his company seized under the Trading with the Enemy Act. He was funding Hitler from America, whilst American soldiers were being killed by German soldiers. Jewish people are also being slaughtered by these same soldiers. Interestingly, the ADL never criticizes any of the Bushes for any of these actions. The ADL, of course, being the Defense League. On February 18th in 1943, the Zionist Isaac Greenbaum, head of the Jewish Agency Rescue Committee, in a speech to the Zionist Executive Council states, and I quote, "If I am asked, could you give from the UJA, United Jewish Appeal, monies to rescue Jews? I say no, and I say again, no." Close quote. He then went on to state, and I quote, "One cow in Palestine is worth more than all the Jews in Poland." Close quote. This should of course not come as any surprise, because the whole idea of Zionist support for the slaughter of innocent Jewish people was to scare the survivors into believing that their only place of safety was Israel, and they would eventually flee to that place. How else do you think that the Zionists could actually ensure that these Jews would leave their beautiful European cities and homes and all the wealth that they've built and the lives that they've been living in order to settle in a desert? In 1944, on 6th of November, Lord Moyne, British minister resident in the Middle East, was assassinated in Cairo by two members of the Jewish terrorist group, the Stern Gang, led by future Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir. He is also responsible for an assassination attempt against Harold McMichael, the High Commissioner of the British Mandate of Palestine, in that same year. Interestingly, he also masterminds another successful assassination this year against the United Nations representative in the Middle East, Count Volker Bernadotte, who, although he had secured the release of 21,000 prisoners from German camps during World War II, was seen by Yitzhak Shamir and his terrorist collaborators as an anti-Zionist. In Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, two further Rothschild World Banks are created. This will sound extremely familiar to you: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. In 1945, the Second World War ends, and it's reported that, remember this IG Farben with all these steel plants, that they were specifically not targeted in the bombing raids on Germany. Interestingly, At the end of the war, they were found to have only sustained 15% damage, although they were the places manufacturing everything needed for the Nazi war. The tribunals that were held at the end of the Second World War to investigate Nazi war crimes censored any materials recording Western assistance towards Hitler. Now for the most important part and the end of this section of the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds take a giant step toward their goal of world domination when the Second League of Nations, called the United Nations, was approved in that year. Remember that their first attempt post the First World War to start and form this League of Nations failed. There were not enough nations to actually support the idea. But the Second World War apparently did the job, and the United Nations was formed. We know today that the United Nations is an agency just meant with Rothschild funding to instill all the New World Order ideologies that the entire world will end up living under. And it's no different in South Africa. You will see United Nations and all their secondary organizations' actions within our local councils, within our provincial parliaments, and within national parliament. They have captured many people. They are having many conferences with our elected officials, telling and dictating to them how they should do their job. And I will make many individual videos in future to still highlight how that is done. You can go to the channel on YouTube, Lauren Evantia, where my wife, who has had lots of experience in these meetings, will explain to you in detail in future how we are captured as a country and the solutions towards freeing us from this tyranny. In the third edition of the Rothschild family and the Rothschild dynasty, I will cover the period post the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations all the way up till today.